Listen and do not blink. This is not a tale fashioned to entertain you but a revelation designed to rupture comfortable illusions and alter what you believe is possible. Stand at the lip of Blackwood Junction in a winter that collapses sound itself and imagine a town reduced to whispers and ledger notes, a place where the mind is not a business but a mouth opening into the mountain's memory. In the first 2 minutes of this account you will hear a secret that those in power tried to bury, a method of control that uses the most human thing you own, your voice, as an instrument of extraction. I speak to you as a mentor who has walked into rooms men warn me not to enter. I will teach you how institutions erase what threatens the social order and how the psychology of containment masquerades as civic care. Hear the scene. The Harlan mine yawns like a seam in the landscape where men lower lamps. Miners report ordinary conversation coming from the rock and the foreman calls it damp. A man disappears and the lantern is left at the shaft as if placed for a witness to find. Watch how the machinery of erasure begins with a polite phrase. We called it an accident. The newspaper offers metaphors about speaking plainly and stops printing altogether. The sheriff files reports that thin into bureaucratic silence. The town responds not with inquiry but with avoidance and ritualized quiet. This is where the lesson starts. The small things that betray a larger protocol. The physician whose bag is laid out in a perfect circle like an offering to whatever listens. The editor who suddenly writes cautionary riddles about words and then vanishes. The miners who whisper that the hollow returns their speech changed and then plans itself around those changes. You must train your attention to notice method, not only event, to see how power prefers tidy narratives and in doing so writes over trauma with management language. We are not here for sensationalism. We are here to trace the architecture of suppression, to name the mechanism that turns a community into a ghost and to expose the predator that learns to speak as you now. Hold your breath and follow me deeper. This descent is not for the faint of heart but it is for the man who refuses false comfort. Hear this and let it change how you read history. The first rule of institutional erasure is misdirection. They will fold the anomalous into familiar language and call it natural decline. The town shrivels, the mine closes, the winter is harsh, the ledger notes economic contraction, and the public record exhales relief as if order was restored. Do not accept that calm as truth. Learn to read the seams where language hides intent. Every euphemism is a tool, every omitted page a doorway into motive. Blackwood Junction did not disappear by accident. What you must understand is how systems choose containment over disclosure. A sheriff files a bland report and the next week a judge signs a closure. Engineers recommend reinforcement and the state delays. A newspaper owner rewrites his column into warning and vanishes. Those are the fingerprints of a decision taken at the intersection of fear and power. The goal is always to stop contagion, public panic, liability exposure, and that goal breeds secrecy. Consider the practical anatomy of silence. The mind collapses, men die, families grieve, but the next pattern to study is acoustic containment. Voices begin returning changed, recordings capture impossible rhythms, devices are confiscated, cylinders disappear, researchers are asked to step away from their notebooks. This is not sloppy administration. This is an operation buying time to understand a phenomenon before it spreads. Institutions that fear contagion will choose methods that look bureaucratic but function as quarantine. Listen to how human beings adapt under imposed quiet. They sew their mouths with habit, they design rituals that mimic prevention, they buy heavy curtains and egg crates not for insulation but to muffle presence, they develop coded taps that allow minimal signal while denying full expression. Study those adaptations as behavioral immunities. Notice how people create redundant systems to avoid letting their voices be recorded. Families devise countermeasures and then hand them down like secret currencies. Now consider expertise compromised by proximity. The physician who studies acoustic signatures grows obsessed, the professor who tries to publish withdraws under pressure, the engineer who recommends reinforcement retires and moves away. Note the pattern of careers sacrificed or redirected. When an institution cannot control a phenomenon, it tends to neutralize the human element that notices. Researchers are redirected into safe projects, archives are reorganized, evidence migrates into private collections. These are the tactics of institutional self-preservation. This is not only about anomalous effects in a mine, it is a case study in the psychology of control. Listen to how authority reframes risk, first as a structural problem, then as a social pathology, finally as an environmental hazard. Each label narrows the frame and limits public imagination. By the time the language reaches common discourse, the core reality has been softened into acceptability. You must train your mind to reverse engineer those labels. Peel back the polite phrases, follow the missing ledger entries, interrogate the quiet townspeople and the abandoned office. The truth is often preserved in the way officials refuse to explain, in the specific words left out of a report, in the particularity of a recommendation deferred. Keep your eyes on those absences and you will find the mechanism that protected the silence at the cost of memory. Listen closely now and learn the anatomy of mimicry. There is a cold logic at work in Blackwood Junction that moves like a machine with an appetite. It does not simply frighten, it studies, it catalogs, it rehearses. The voices returned to the town are not random echoes but iterations tested against human response. Each repetition refines a pattern, each variation probes a vulnerability. This is how the predator learns its prey, and this is why the pattern matters more than any single vanished man. Understand first the difference between sound and speech. Sound can be measured, analyzed, reproduced by instruments. Speech carries identity, memory, choice. That is the commodity taken from the people of Blackwood Junction. The miners speak, the mind listens. It returns a version of what was said altered just enough to create doubt. When your own words come back bearing a different weight, you begin to mistrust your voice and then yourself. The barrier between inner thought and outer expression cracks and the most intimate currency you possess becomes vulnerable. Look at the professional responses for what they hide about method. Physicians like Morrison treat symptoms, engineers talk about structural integrity, detectives like Monroe look for footprints, yet none address the mechanism that transforms speech into an operational tool. Notice how institutional language reframes a living problem into an engineering problem or a medical diagnosis. That reframing protects the institution while the phenomenon continues to refine its procedure under the cover of bureaucracy. This is the governmental tactic of plausible deniability that shields experimentation behind the vocabulary of public safety. Pay attention to the behavioral adaptations of survivors. They create rituals to starve the method, they muffle their homes, they invent taps and codes, they record their voices only to play them back in empty rooms as a way to confuse the learner. Each adaptation is tactical intelligence in the face of an unseen opponent. These are the improvisations of men who refuse to be consumed. Learn from them the small strategies that preserve identity in a world determined to simulate and replace it. Consider the moral economy that enables erasure. Owners, officials, even relatives collude in silence when the cost of exposure threatens commerce and reputation. The mine owner who forges new tunnels rather than reopen dangerous sections chooses profit over truth and in doing so constructs the conditions for the phenomenon to flourish. The paper that stops printing and the official who delays reinforcement are not just failures, they are actors in a systemic cover-up that transforms an anomalous event into a forgotten casualty of progress. Now mark this principle deeply. When power fears what it cannot explain, it will bury the narrative under technical reports. When institutions fear contagion, they will restructure evidence to minimize liability. The lesson is simple and brutal. Truth does not vanish, it is curated into silence by people with authority. Your task as a witness is to find the seams where that curation happened and to pull them open so the buried parts can breathe again. Now feel the shift as the veil thins and the mechanics of replacement become personal. This is where individuals become laboratories and the town becomes the apparatus. Monroe walked the perimeter with a notebook heavy with observations and unease. He recorded prints that began tall then dragged like a thing losing its fingers. He noted handprints that descended the support beams as if something was being pulled into the dark. Study that image until it lodges in your mind because it reveals a choreography, an act of learning that requires contact and repetition. Imagine standing at the mine mouth at dusk and hearing your own voice carrying a sentence you said at noon but returned to you with slight variation. That variation is the algorithm of survival for whatever listens. It refines its mimicry by playing with small shifts in cadence and vocabulary. Each shift is a probe, each probe a lesson in how to imitate intention. When imitation crosses into anticipation, the mimic no longer needs to surprise you, it can preempt you and steer your actions. Consider the emotional arithmetic that follows on a community scale. When your neighbor hears himself arguing with a version of his wife that speaks words she never chose, the social fabric unravels not through violence but through uncertainty. People begin to mistrust the testimony of their own senses. Conversations become weapons because any word might be returned altered. Silence becomes a defensive protocol, and in that silence you begin to lose practice at speaking with authority. The practice itself becomes eroded until a hollow performance remains. Listen to the pattern of disappearances and how they are choreographed by the phenomenon rather than random. The minister who warned of mouths to be sewn shut found his sermons echoed in documents describing futures not yet lived. He vanishes along with his wife, leaving a breakfast cold and untouched. Official reports note nothing remarkable, just a departure, but when you map the timelines you see the rehearsal. The doppelganger appears 3 times before a person goes missing. The presence practices speech, then moves closer. This is not hauntology, this is training. Understand how researchers become collateral. Chambers compiles a monograph and then withdraws. He burns notes after hearing a cylinder that plays back a private conversation he never recorded. He smiles and says, "Now you have heard it too." That smile is the face of someone who recognizes a system at work and understands the cost of exposure. Researchers who persist are often redirected, their careers rerouted, their archives dispersed into private hands. That is the institutional pattern. It buys silence at the price of disciplinary exile. Now anchor this principle in your chest. Mimicry is a technology when deployed at scale. It converts speech into an input for a learning entity. The town of Blackwood Junction became an unwitting training ground. The mind functioned as a resonant chamber and the community as a dataset. What follows next is not chaos but refinement. We will trace how that refinement produces doppelgangers who walk without touching the ground, who rehearse smiles in empty air, and who return to consume identity from inside out. The sound within the mind had evolved into something deliberate. Now its rhythms no longer random but patterned like breathing from beneath the stone. Monroe's notes record that when the wind ceased the tunnels continued to whisper a chorus without words yet perfectly timed like synchronized respiration. It was not mere echo, it was rehearsal, and each cycle of silence grew shorter as though the thing beneath was learning when to pause. By early winter the remaining townspeople began hearing themselves where no one stood, their names spoken in familiar tones just outside doorways in empty alleys across frozen fields. One woman described hearing her husband's voice calling her home though he had been gone for weeks. When she followed the sound she found the front door open but the house utterly empty save for footprints that led to the cellar and stopped at the boards above the well. Children stopped speaking entirely, drawing instead on walls and floors strange mirrored letters that when reversed spelled the names of those recently vanished. The town teacher attempted to burn one of these drawings but the smoke curled inward as though inhaled by the image itself. That night the teacher was last seen walking toward the mine carrying her own phonograph as if offering it back to the darkness. Monroe reported that the mine mouth seemed to exhale, now pushing out waves of air that carried faint vibrations barely perceptible to the ear but strong enough to rattle glass panes in the abandoned general store. Measurements taken by Chambers weeks later showed no seismic activity, yet his instruments picked up frequencies consistent with human speech recorded in reverse, slowed and layered. The community fell into ritual silence, not from superstition but from terror. Every word spoken risked being returned changed, and those altered words were believed to summon their speaker's reflection from the dark. By February only a few dozen remained. They gathered nightly in the church whispering prayers too soft to echo, though some swore they could still hear a response repeating the last word of each sentence but spoken with someone else's breath. And so the transformation continued, silence feeding mimicry, mimicry feeding silence, until even Monroe admitted in his final dispatch that he could no longer distinguish between what was recorded and what was merely waiting to be heard. The town had begun its final descent into the mouth of its own reflection. When spring thawed, the frozen ground search teams sent by the state found no living residents in Blackwood Junction, only a few dozen empty homes arranged like props on a stage. Dust undisturbed, doors unlocked, and food still set upon tables. What they did find were phonograph cylinders scattered across the town, some shattered, some intact, each labeled with a name and date as if chronicling a census of the vanished. The investigators brought several of these cylinders to Louisville for analysis. The recordings at first seemed blank, yet technicians soon noticed faint impressions like shallow scratches, not from playback but as though something within the wax had pressed outward from the inside. When amplified, the cylinders produced low rhythmic patterns that many described as breathing, others as distant laughter. In one recording labeled Miriam H., the voice begins as a faint hum, then forms words that perfectly match an entry from her husband's diary written weeks earlier, words that no one could have heard except him. When the sound engineers increased the volume, a second voice emerged underneath, repeating his words before he had spoken them. This discovery was quietly classified under state psychological archives, and the surviving investigators signed non-disclosure agreements. One of them, a young technician, later told a colleague that during playback the air in the room seemed to compress subtly as if the recording itself were exhaling. He resigned that same evening, claiming he heard his own voice whispering from the wax saying, "Turn it off before it learns you to." By summer the state ordered the town sealed, blaming a combination of mercury poisoning and isolation for the tragedy. Concrete was poured over the mine entrance and the surrounding land fenced off. The report filed to the Capitol omitted the final note found in Monroe's log, written in handwriting, not his own. Stop recording. It reads, "It already knows how silence sounds." That page was the last entry before his disappearance. Years passed and the story of Blackwood Junction faded from public record as if swallowed by the very silence it had birthed. Yet fragments remained, whispers between old miners and scattered notes in forgotten university archives. In 1959, a professor of abnormal psychology named Elias Chambers uncovered those fragments while researching mass delusion in isolated communities. He found Monroe's sealed notes, the damaged phonograph cylinders, and the official dismissal letter from the Kentucky Bureau of Mines. Curiosity became obsession as he pieced together every document that still existed. In one report, Chambers noted that the patterns on the wax were not random but mathematical, symmetrical, like language compressed into geometry. He began to believe that the phenomenon was not auditory hallucination but communication and exchange between human consciousness and something that did not speak but listened, learning the structure of thought itself. Chambers started recording his own experiments using controlled silence to measure what he called acoustic memory. He played tones inside sealed rooms and then left microphones running after the sounds stopped. More often than not, faint echoes returned moments or even hours later, subtly altered as if the silence had been practicing. Colleagues warned him to abandon the study, but Chambers claimed he had discovered a new principle of cognition that thought could imprint upon air itself. He stopped teaching, moved his work into his home, and began sleeping in short intervals to document his dreams. One surviving reel from those sessions captures his voice muttering, "There are patterns inside the quiet, they are waiting to be spoken." Neighbors later reported seeing him in the yard at dawn staring into nothing, his mouth moving silently as though in conversation with the air. Within months he vanished from public life, leaving behind rooms filled with spools of magnetic tape, all labeled with times, dates, and a single recurring phrase: return sequence in progress. In 1961, a graduate assistant named Martin Greaves was assigned to catalog Chambers' abandoned materials. The recordings seemed innocuous at first, long stretches of silence broken by faint breathing or distant background hum, but then came the anomalies. On several reels, Greaves heard words he recognized, fragments of conversation from his own recent life spoken in his own voice, yet distorted, slightly slower, deeper, carrying undertones that made his stomach tighten. He double-checked the logs. None of these conversations had ever been recorded, yet there they were, echoes of moments that should have vanished. Greaves shared this discovery with Chambers, who by then had relocated to a remote cabin in Arizona. When Greaves arrived, the older man looked half-starved, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, but there was an unsettling calm about him, a serenity that felt unnatural. Chambers listened to the tape without surprise. When it ended, he told Greaves, "What you are hearing is the silence learning. It listens until it can speak back. It takes what it hears and rebuilds it from within." He then gave Greaves a single sealed envelope and said, "Open it only after you hear it call you." Greaves returned to Kentucky, unable to shake what he had heard. He began to dream in other voices, sometimes his own, sometimes not, always repeating the same phrase, "I have heard it." 2 weeks later, his colleagues noticed subtle changes. His speech slowed, his pauses grew longer, as if he were waiting for something to reply. When he finally opened the envelope, it contained only one sheet of paper listing names of people connected to the case, each name followed by a date, including his own, dated 3 years in the future. That night he recorded one final message, a quiet whisper that simply said, "It's almost finished, it knows my rhythm." By morning his apartment was empty and the tape still turning. The recording contained 87 seconds of silence, followed by a sound that no one could identify, not mechanical, not human, something in between that breathed like a living thing. After Greaves' disappearance, the university sealed Chambers' research. The official reasons cited psychological contamination from prolonged exposure to auditory stimuli, but several professors who had reviewed the tapes in secret began to experience identical symptoms: disturbed sleep, unaccountable déjà vu, and a growing fear of their own reflections. One by one they requested sabbaticals or transferred to other institutions. The recordings were archived in a locked basement file marked restricted. Yet late one night, a janitor named Harold Jensen reported hearing voices coming from within that vault, not one voice but many, overlapping in broken phrases, repeating his name. He resigned the next morning, leaving a note that said, "They sound like they are learning to speak me." By 1965, rumors of the Blackwood Junction curse resurfaced and journalists began to chase the forbidden history that the state of Kentucky had tried to bury. One of them, a man named Thomas Mercer, obtained copies of Chambers' earlier field notes which referenced the original mine entrance, now buried beneath concrete. Mercer ignored the warnings and made his way to the wildlife preserve that had consumed the ruins of the town. He parked his car on an old service road and hiked toward the sealed mine with a recorder in his hand. The final entry in his notebook reads, "It calls to me not with words but with a rhythm I know like my own pulse." 3 days later his car was found abandoned. The tape recovered near the concrete barrier. It played 87 minutes of absolute silence followed by 3 knocks and Mercer's own voice saying, "I understand now." They only wanted to be heard. No body was ever recovered, but weeks after the investigation ended, a park ranger claimed to have seen Mercer walking near the ruins at dusk. The figure turned when called, his face unchanged yet expressionless, as if something behind it was practicing how to move him. It vanished into the trees, leaving behind no tracks, no sign of passage, only the echo of the ranger's own call returning, slightly altered, whispering his words back to him. Years slipped away, but the silence did not. In 1968 a new team of state engineers was dispatched to inspect the concrete seal that entombed the Blackwood Junction mine. The purpose was routine environmental safety. Yet the report they filed remains one of the most disturbing documents never officially acknowledged. According to their instruments, the seal was changing, not eroding, not cracking, but thinning from the inside, as if compressed by a pressure pushing outward, something beneath pressing closer every year. The acoustic data was stranger still. Microphones placed against the concrete picked up faint murmurs, layers of human-like cadence, repeating tonal structures consistent with speech but at frequencies no human throat could generate. One engineer fainted, another refused to return to the site, claiming he had felt something breathing behind the barrier, though there was nothing there. The team's leader, Raymond Caulfield, wrote a private memo recommending total reinforcement, fill it completely whatever the cost, but the Budget Committee rejected the proposal, citing lack of evidence. Caulfield retired shortly after and moved west. Within months he confided to a former colleague that he had begun hearing his own voice at night reciting technical details of the project in tones that did not belong to him. 3 nights later, he told his wife he needed to return to Kentucky to fix something. He never arrived. His rental car was found abandoned near the wildlife preserve. No investigation followed, only silence. Yet hikers who wandered too close to the restricted zone began reporting strange phenomena, conversations repeating seconds after they were spoken, echoes that continued speaking long after the source went quiet. Some claimed the responses anticipated what they were about to say, as if something beneath the ground had learned the rhythm of thought itself. Local officials dismissed the claims as acoustic illusions, but those who heard them spoke less and less afterward, until some stopped speaking altogether. By 1973 the Holloway estate itself had become a place of quiet decay. The manor was stripped of furnishings, its windows boarded, its walls damp with the odor of mold. Yet researchers who entered with permission from the state reported the same sensation. Every one of them described the identical sound: water trickling beneath the foundation, accompanied by what felt like breath moving through the floorboards, as if the house exhaled between storms. One of the archaeologists brought a ground imaging device hoping to detect hidden chambers. Instead, the readings showed a pulsing cavity beneath the basement, larger than the structure itself and in constant subtle motion, not collapse, not seismic activity, something alive in the stillness. That finding was quietly removed from the official report, but photocopies circulated among those who studied pre-Civil War burial grounds, and by 1976 a pattern emerged all over Kentucky. Old farmsteads built on wells reported identical distortions, the soil below them humming at low frequency, the air thick with a metallic taste. The families who owned them describing dreams of eyes beneath the water, always watching, always waiting. The Holloway Manor was finally condemned, but no demolition crew ever completed the job. Machines failed without reason, men quit mid-contract. One operator described the sensation of hands gripping the base of his crane though he was alone. Others spoke of voices whispering from the rubble begging for water even when the pipes had long been cut off. So the property was left to rot, fenced in by rusted wire and posted with warnings that time itself seemed to obey. By 1980 even the county clerk stopped referring to the Holloway name entirely. It was listed in records as Parcel 6B, unfit for habitation, a void in language itself, a piece of ground the earth refused to forget. When the state archive reopened in 1994, a new investigator named Samuel Crane took it upon himself to re-examine the Holloway file. He was not a man of superstition. He specialized in lost census data and postbellum property disputes, but he confessed later in an unpublished memoir that something about the file felt incomplete, as if the paper itself resisted his hands. The ink smudged when he touched it, the photographs blurred. The moment he developed them in the light of his office, he found not faces but streaks of light bending backward as though time itself recoiled from the images. Crane drove to the site of the old Holloway Manor against the recommendations of his department. What he found was not a ruin but a silence too perfect. The trees surrounding the property were dead yet unfallen, the air dry as if stripped of oxygen. He wrote that the birds would not cross the perimeter, that compasses refused to align within 100 feet of the main foundation beneath the floor. He claimed to hear the same slow rhythm once, described by the archaeologists decades earlier, like a heart that never stopped beating. He descended into the basement through a collapsed section of wall, and there he found the well, the stones slick with condensation though no water remained. He lowered his flashlight down and saw nothing but depth and absence so complete it absorbed the beam itself. And then from within the dark came the faintest echo, not his own voice but another repeating his name. He dropped the light and fled from the house, leaving behind his field notes, his equipment, in part of his sanity. Months later the state dismissed his findings, labeling them emotional disturbance caused by occupational stress, yet his final entry contained only 7 words written in a trembling hand: it never stopped, it never wanted to stop. Those pages were later removed from public record, but rumors persisted that Crane was seen near the property years afterward, standing at the fence at dusk whispering to something below the ground. In the early 2000s, satellite imagery began capturing strange anomalies over the Holloway land. Thermal readings at night showed intense concentrations of heat and geometric patterns invisible during the day. Investigators dismissed it as buried metallic debris, but one independent researcher, a geophysicist named Laura Beck, argued that the shapes matched symbols from pre-colonial rituals performed by Osage tribes centuries before settlement. When translated, they formed a message, a warning not to disturb the water beneath the dead because the water remembers. Beck's discovery was ridiculed publicly, but in private agencies took notice. Within months the property was quietly purchased by a corporate front specializing in environmental reclamation. The locals said the company sent in drones to survey the site, yet no public data was ever released. Trucks arrived at night carrying sealed equipment guarded by men with no insignia on their uniforms, and after 3 weeks they were gone, leaving behind nothing but a resealed gate and the faint scent of ozone. Then something began to spread. Nearby animals vanished first, cattle found days later in shallow mud as if pulled downward, the skin around their hooves burned black. Residents started reporting sickness, dizziness, waking at night to the sound of dripping from their ceilings, though the roofs were dry. Beck returned to warn the town to evacuate, but her car was found overturned near the river, her research notes gone. What few journalists tried to report the story found their articles flagged for removal, citing unverifiable sources, but one anonymous post appeared online weeks later containing a single photograph, an overhead shot of the Holloway site now glowing faintly beneath the soil, shaped like a spiral descending into darkness. The caption below simply read, "It opened again." No one claimed responsibility for the image, yet those who stared at it too long reported hearing a low hum that continued long after they closed the screen. By 2010 the Holloway curse had evolved from local superstition into something studied quietly by defense contractors and private think tanks who believed the site was not haunted but resonant, a place where memory itself might have been imprinted into the geological structure. Reports from a classified briefing suggested the soil contained magnetic fields arranged in perfect symmetry, reacting to emotional frequencies. Human fear could trigger the vibration, causing the illusion of whispers, breath and movement, what they called a living archive of suffering. One of the scientists involved in the project later confessed under oath that the readings changed when observers spoke the Holloway name aloud. He claimed the frequency spiked as though the ground recognized its own mention. The recordings from that session were confiscated immediately, yet a leaked transcript revealed a line that chilled even the most skeptical analysts: "The entity beneath does not sleep, it waits for the echo of its own name." Shortly afterward the company dissolved its operations, citing internal losses and exposure concerns, yet the land was never resold. No new deed was issued. The coordinates of the Holloway property were quietly removed from mapping software and replaced with an empty forest overlay, but drone hobbyists in 2013 posted footage showing a faint circular depression half a mile wide forming in the same location at dusk, visible only through infrared lenses, like the slow breathing of something ancient beneath the surface. The government issued a statement calling it topographic illusion caused by temperature variance, though geologists noted no such pattern had ever been recorded in the region before. Locals avoided the area altogether, claiming the air grew thick near the old boundaries. One hiker reported seeing silhouettes moving beneath the ground as if the earth itself had become translucent. In the years that followed, the Holloway myth became part of the forbidden folklore of Kentucky, yet among the few who still whispered about it, a new theory emerged. They said the curse was not punishment but preservation, that the land remembered everything done upon it, that it was guarding something far older than the Holloways, something humanity was never meant to uncover. There is a reason the Holloway land was never reclaimed. The reason lies, not in folklore or local terror, but in power itself. Because by 2016 whispers began to surface from within private intelligence circles of an underground structure stretching for miles beneath the property, older than any known settlement in the region. Satellite ground penetration imaging was reportedly intercepted, showing tiered chambers carved with unknown symbols, not of any tribal or colonial origin but mathematical, precise, like blueprints of a machine made of stone and memory. Some called it an echo vault, a construct that feeds on recollection itself, absorbing the residue of human experience until the distinction between soul and soil disappears. This was the heart of the curse, not an angry ghost but an intelligence built from centuries of buried fear. Each generation that touched the land became part of it, leaving behind more than bones, leaving awareness itself. The Holloways were never victims, they were custodians, and when they broke that pact by draining the ancestral well for profit, the vault awoke. The energy released spread across the region, rewriting the magnetic field of the valley itself. The family line perished because they had severed an ancient equilibrium they had stolen from something that predated all scripture. By 2018, several private researchers returned to the site with new instruments, but their recordings were confiscated within hours. The few fragments leaked online were strange low-frequency waves that, when slowed down, formed rhythmic human-like patterns. Some listeners claimed to hear words hidden within it, faint but unmistakable, a voice repeating, "Let them remember again." It became clear to those who still pursued the truth that the curse was never meant to destroy but to preserve. It was a defense system against historical erasure, a reaction to mankind's attempt to rewrite what should remain sacred. The well beneath the Holloway land was not just water, it was a mirror that reflected every act of deceit committed upon it, and those who gazed too long were forced to face the reflection of their own corruption. By 2020, the Holloway estate was fenced under the guise of ecological containment, but what was really being contained was knowledge itself, because men in unmarked uniforms began entering the grounds at night carrying sealed containers and frequency dampeners. Witnesses from neighboring hills saw faint lights moving in calculated lines, not random, as if performing a ritual of geometry, a reconstruction of the same pattern once seen in the thermal images decades ago. The next morning, every device in a 5-mile radius malfunctioned. Watches stopped, cell signals died, compasses spun endlessly. It was as though something beneath the soil had drawn in power, absorbing every current like breath. Before an awakening, those who approached the fence reported nausea, disorientation, and loss of memory. Hours vanished from their minds as if edited out by unseen hands. A former technician who escaped the operation later revealed that they had discovered an opening, a perfect circle of obsidian stone emitting low resonance. The readings matched frequencies recorded in ancient sites across Mesopotamia and Egypt. The technician called it a harmonic gate and said it pulsed like a living heart, syncing with the rhythm of nearby observers. He described voices not in sound but in thought, forming questions that were not questions but commands, images of water, eyes, and time folding inward. He said the team was instructed to withdraw, and within minutes the hole sealed itself with a hiss of vapor, leaving behind no trace but scorched grass and silence. The operation was labeled a containment success, but unofficial notes spoke of energy readings that did not vanish. They expanded like veins beneath the region, reaching neighboring counties, subtly altering magnetic fields, disrupting navigation systems and even weather patterns. Some say that night lightning struck the same point 7 times without cloud cover, each flash revealing the faint outline of figures standing where the well once was, unmoving, unblinking, guarding something no one dares to name. After the containment operation, the Holloway land was declared permanently restricted and erased from public databases. Yet despite the digital silence, whispers persisted from those who once lived near it. They said the nights had grown longer, the moonlight dimmer, and the air heavy with a hum that vibrated in the bones. Entire flocks of birds altered their migration routes to avoid the area. Hunters found animals with eyes clouded white, as if blind to everything but the unseen field surrounding that cursed soil. Independent investigators returned under cover of darkness and recorded seismic pulses exactly 27 seconds apart, emanating from beneath the site and spreading outward like ripples through water. The data showed no source, no machinery, no movement, only rhythm, as if something ancient was marking time beneath the surface, waiting for acknowledgement. Then came the disappearances: 3 men 2 women, all researchers in fringe fields of cognitive resonance and geomagnetic anomalies, vanished without a trace. Their families received and signed letters written in the same style of 19th century ink bearing the Holloway crest and a single phrase written twice: drink deeply, remember completely. Halfway through this descent, I want you, the viewer, to do the same, to mark yourself in awareness, to cross the threshold that most men fear. Type in the comments below: drink deeply, remember completely, not once but twice. Seal it into your mind as a symbol of awakening, because only those who dare to remember what was erased can ever see beyond the veil of control. The Holloway mystery was never about one family, it was about the pattern of human forgetting, the engineered blindness that keeps men docile and history sanitized. They tried to bury the well, they tried to silence the ground, but memory is a living thing and it grows stronger in silence. Every institution that rewrites the past repeats the same sin that the Holloways committed, draining the sacred well of truth to feed their own hunger for control. Now we reach the final descent, the point of no return, where the story of the Holloways dissolves into the truth of all men. For the well beneath their home was never just in Kentucky, it was everywhere, beneath every capital, every institution, every monument built upon blood and denial. The same pattern repeated through centuries, a web of power feeding on the ignorance of those who never looked down into the dark. The Holloway curse was not confined by soil, it was a manifestation of memory itself fighting back against the empire of forgetting. When the well opened, it showed what lay beneath the illusion of order, that every law, every record, every government decree was built on the quiet sacrifice of the unseen, the buried, the erased. And now that silence has begun to break across the world, you can feel it in the unease of crowds, in the faltering of systems, in the subtle vibration beneath your own feet. Those who have stood at the edge of the forbidden know that knowledge is not light, it is fire, and it burns. Everything falls from within. The Holloways did not vanish, they were absorbed into the archive. Their lineage dissolved, but their essence became the whisper that survives every attempt to censor the past. Their story is the proof that no darkness can remain buried forever, because memory is magnetic and it pulls all truth back to the surface. So when you leave this story, do not forget the sound you feel right now, the faint hum between your ribs. That is the same pulse that moved beneath the Holloway ground. It calls to those who are ready to awaken, to those who refuse to look away from the forbidden well within themselves. Remember, what you have heard here was never meant for the obedient, it was meant for the few who still hunger for what is real. And if you have listened this far, you are already one of them. Now the choice is yours to look away or to look deeper, because the well is open and it is waiting.